I'm extremely happy to be seeing all of you guys actually here tonight, notwithstanding all the issues that I think all of us actually went through in the last year, and the fact actually that we were able collectively actually to produce this issue. I know that we should be waiting still a couple of minutes, but maybe I can start with just an introduction, and I can start actually by thanking the people who work with me on this issue. The first person that I should mention is Christina Rapaski. She's our new assistant editor, by now not so new anymore because she's been with us more than 6 months. She's been editing actually the text with me. So, I mean, that's the person to whom I would say I owe the most. But other people actually work with us on this issue, most notably head of design, Sasha Loebe, who worked on design with Oliver Long, who used to be our in-house designer, but now left us to pursue further education in Tallinn. And so, of course, we wish him all the best in his new adventure. And obviously, our colleagues in the communication studio, Annalisa Reynolds, and especially head of communication studio, Ryan Dillon, who has been really with us actually throughout all the steps of the production of the issue, as usual, I would say. And of course, there would be many other people that we should thank, obviously our students, our colleagues at the AA, some of whom are here tonight and some of whom actually contributed to the issue. But these people are, of course, too many. So I just wanted actually to mention the people who, in fact, actively worked on the issue, because actually, if we should really list the number of people who have been supportive in one way or the other, it should be really a very, very long list. And so I'm grateful to all of you from the bottom of my heart. And so tonight, actually, what I would like to do would be to introduce the issue. So I'm going to just give a very brief introduction about what you're going to find in the issue. And I hope that most of you actually already received your copy of files. But for those who haven't, or for those who maybe are not actually AA members, I'm going just to run through a kind of trailer, if you want, actually, of the contents of this issue, just to give you an idea of the themes that we tried to discuss in the current issue. And then I would like actually to give the floor to our authors. The way actually I invited a few of these authors, obviously it would have been too much actually to invite all of them, but I invited actually a selection of authors. I chose these authors based on the possibility of discussing a few themes that I thought were particularly relevant in relationship to what all of us as architects, designers, but also as citizens, I would say, actually had to go through in the last year or so, during which actually we produced this issue. And therefore you will understand why when I will show you the themes that I hope to discuss actually with you guys tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So as you can see, actually, the issue that we are launching actually tonight is issue number 78. That came out officially last December, so 2021, as you can see on the cover. Every issue, actually, our head of design, Sasha Loebe, designs a completely new cover. In fact, actually 3 new covers. So, if you have friends who received a different cover, you will be able actually to read the Easter egg that Sasha left us in the cover that is only really discoverable when you see the 3 covers together. And I'm going to leave it at that. The first file actually that you will encounter in the issue is a file about the body. So the files are organized as usual alphabetically. So really the order in which we put them, it's not a conceptual order, it's just the alphabetical order of the keywords. But in this case, I think it's actually quite appropriate to have body as the first file, because again, for the second year in a row, we are in a situation in which actually the politics of the body, the architectural politics of the body, are very much at the center of what we are all concerned with. And 2 authors actually contributed to this file, David Turturro and Christina Varvia, who is here with us actually tonight. And David actually contributed a piece on Viennese actionism and the relationship between art and architecture in that context. And Christina is going to tell us a little bit actually tonight about her research and about the way actually her research challenges the relationship between the body and conventional notions of architecture. So really using the category of the body as a tool, if you want, actually to rethink architectural agency at large. And the second file is a file about cinema. It's an interesting keyword that we've never actually dealt with before in the couple of issues that I edited. And I'm really happy that this Portuguese contributor, José Luís Postolo da Saldanha, contributed a really interesting actually essay on a very extraordinary building, I would say, in Portugal, the Hotel Arribas, that was also the set for a movie by Wim Wenders. Of course, it's a much more complex story than that weaves together actually architecture, politics, and and cinema, in fact. And you're all welcome to read it in the issue. File number 3, community. Community contains actually 2 essays, one by 2 authors, Xiang Ren and Derong Kong. And Xiang and Derong actually brought us to China with an analysis of a specific typology, the drum tower, that they really read as a symptom of social dynamics and social rituals, specifically in a minority ethnic group in China, the drum tower. And Azza Boualam contributed, on the other hand, an essay also in the file about community, about mosques in the United Arab Emirates, and specifically Sharjah, where she comes from. And I think actually Azza's essay is a very provocative essay because it reads the contemporary state of architecture actually in Sharjah against models of architecture, in fact, that predate the formation of the United Arab Emirates. And it's titled From Coral to Concrete. File number 4, environment, I think will be very much at the center of the discussion tonight because the 2 authors are here, both of them with us, Thandi Loewenson and Elisa Iturbe. And Thandi actually contributed a piece that is called Stratigraphy of Lusaka, where we see, I think, a really thought-provoking and original way of overlapping discourses about environment with discourses about actually storytelling and I would say social narratives at large. Beautifully illustrated actually by her own photos. On the other hand, actually, Elisa, in her essay, tries to sketch a brief, what she calls a brief history of carbon form. I think this is a really important essay for me personally, because I think Elisa's research is one of the very few, I would say, pieces of work or voices that gave me personally, I think, a really interesting tool to rethink the reasons of the ecological crisis that we are in. And she does this through the definition of the notion of carbon form, which I think she's going to tell us about actually later tonight. Then file number 5, home. And I'm happy to have one of the 2 authors of home actually tonight here with us, Bushra Mohamed. And the 2 files actually, the file contains 2 contributions, one by Bushra and one by Flesh Okunrebido. And both actually says deal with typologies. In the case of Bushra, actually the typology of the compound house, and in the case of Flash, actually the typology of the affine. And in both cases, what I think is interesting is that the typology is really used as a tool, as a conceptual tool, actually to challenge, I would say, notions of family and what it means actually to construct a household. So in a situation in which actually the architectural fact becomes the symptom of a much, much deeper, if you want, actually social construct. Then file number 6, public. We have actually 2 contributions, one by Calvin Chua and one by Manijeh Verghese and Maddie Kessler, who are here with us actually tonight. I'm really glad that in this case, the file has been produced with both contributions actually from AA alumni, because both Calvin and Manijeh and Maddie are alumni actually of the AA. And the 2 essays sketch almost like the 2 opposite sides of what it means to produce public architecture today. Because on the one hand, actually, Calvin, in his Engaging North Korea, brings us to, I think, the last context on Earth with architecture cannot be but public, because obviously in North Korea, the power of the state is such that any type of architecture is directly a product of the state. And on the other hand, of course, Maddie and Manijeh, who curated the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale that just closed, bring us on the completely opposite, if you want, actually, context, back to the UK, so the context that most of us, I guess, actually know best, where the production actually of what we call public space sometimes, in fact, actually is asked, it comes, in fact, actually from the private sphere. So where, in fact, actually the definition or the notion of what is basically a public space that has been produced by the private is very much one of the main challenges, I would say, for designers who want to discuss urban agency today in the UK. Last file, last thematic file, territory. We have here one of the 2 authors, David Burns. And in this file, actually, David Burns and Jack Rusk actually discuss 2 different notions of actually construction of territory, specifically when it comes to the relationship between territorial dynamics and extraction of value, or exploitation, if you want, actually, of the territory. David does that with a really for me personally, incredibly moving essay, photo essay that he's going to talk about actually later about a territory in Australia that has been an incredible victim of exploitation, both environmentally, but I would say also socially. And Jack Rusk actually brings us to a different yet similar context in Chaco Canyon in contemporary United States, where he actually sketches a genealogy of a territory that is very much at the center of the debate between archaeologists for the way actually the Chaco Canyon civilization apparently ended historically, so centuries ago. But it is still very much at the center of the debate today due to the current exploitation actually of this area for the purpose of, obviously, of oil production. And then finally, we have, as usual, actually a perspectives file. So a file of reviews. In this case, actually, we have Michael Robinson Cohen, Joseph Instance, Francesca Dell'Aglio, and Darian Knoblauch, who contributed actually reviews to this file. So I want to thank all of them for contributing these really interesting, actually, glances, I would say, on what is going on actually today. And I really want actually to underline the presence again of a review by Francesca. Francesca is becoming somehow our resident Biennale expert, because she already contributed actually a piece that criticized actually the politics of architectural biennales in the previous issue. So in a way, our relationship with her continues. And finally, we have a thematic file, let's say, a special, if you want, actually file dedicated to the ethics of dust. That is an artwork by artist Jorge Otero Pailos. Some of you might remember that he did this rather spectacular installation in 2016 in Westminster Hall that was titled The Ethics of Dust. In this file, actually, we asked a number of people to reflect on that rather extraordinary, actually, artwork, and on the making, especially, actually, of the artwork that involved a number of people, not only the artist himself, but also people from Westminster, curators, archival experts, and so on and so forth. So I think for me, this was a really interesting file because it puts the artwork in the perspective of the way in which actually it's being produced and then maintained, and it goes out into the world and it's broadcasted and so on and so forth. And so with this, I hope that I gave you actually a rapid overview of who contributed to the issue and what are the themes that we wish to discuss. But with that said, actually tonight I was hoping actually to discuss two couples of terms, and then finally one theme, and maybe to wrap up the conversation. The two couples of terms are home and public and environment and territory. So it should be rather clear why these two couples, because they are, in fact, terms that are very often perceived as being in a kind of dichotomy, one against the other, or one defined, in negative, in relationship with the other. And yet, I think that, of course, the challenges that we went through in the last couple of years have profoundly changed the way we relate, or we even understand, really, actually, these terms. So the first couple is obviously home and public, and the authors that we have here tonight, as I was saying earlier, are Bushra Mohamed and and Manijeh and Mehdi. So I would like just to very briefly introduce them. Bushra is the unit master of Diploma Unit 2. She's an architect and writer, and specifically she's the co-founder of Studio Niali, a design research partnership that studies diasporic cultural identities, which is also a theme that is very much actually at the center of the unit that she runs with our colleague Nana Biamo-Foso. And the other couple of authors that we have here with us tonight is Manijeh Verghese and Mehdi Kessler. Again, as I said, actually they are AA graduates, so that makes me very proud. Manijeh is obviously the unit master of Diploma Unit 12, together with Inigo Mens. And she's also the head of public engagement, in fact, actually at the AA. So we should thank her, first of all, for organizing really actually the event of tonight, because it's really all due to her at the end of the day. And Mehdi and Manijeh together are the directors of Unseen Architecture. And they are also the co-curator of the British Pavilion at the 17th Venice Biennale. So it's a biennale that actually just closed, but that while we were producing the issue was very much actually happening exactly at that point in time. So I think the production of their essay that is related to their participation in the Biennale has been quite interesting, because it went in parallel with the opening of the pavilion, and then basically the feedback, I guess, that they got about the pavilion, which was, I would say, really overwhelmingly positive and deservedly so. And so I would like to give the floor now to maybe Bushra first, and then Manijeh and Mehdi, who are going to bring us very, very briefly, actually, in their research, to give us an idea of what they contributed to the issue, and then maybe we can have a bit of a conversation about this relationship, this kind of fraught relationship maybe between the home, what is home, and what is public. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. That's really great, very generous introduction. I'm also going to share my screen just for a couple of slides. So just bear with me while I do that. Is that full screen? Yes, great, thank you. So yeah, as you've kind of very generously introduced already, I looked at me and my teaching partner, Nana Bayomafosu, have both been looking at the compound house as a typology, and it kind of started as a way of trying to instigate some kind of like knowledge exchange between the West and the global South. And it was based on a research project that we are currently making a publication for, called The Course of Empire and the Compound House as an African Housing Typology. And the research was really trying to, I guess, make a relationship between how the compound house manifests itself in different African countries in different ways. And of course, like, there are distinctions based on climatic zones and cultures, regions, ethnicities, but really to, yeah, I guess, unpack the history of the continent and how these borders have kind of changed over time. And beyond, like, after doing the initial research, looking at those different case studies across the continent, it became quite clear that in order to really understand them, they would need to be this like focus on a particular country. So we have picked Ghana because we'd started traveling there and doing the case study research in this country. So this is kind of the first, let's say, of many. And the reason why I want to show this map is to kind of show how the thinking started around the different sort of ethnic groups that actually overlap these physical boundaries that were drawn up in the late 1800s during colonial rule. So that the boundary is actually a moving part that I guess doesn't really define the place, and what defines it is the people. So I looked at, or we've been looking at, and for this file issue, I looked at these different case studies and based them primarily on the climatic zone. So the Lobi in northern Ghana, which is much more part of the Harmattan season, which Flash actually covers in her description of Nigeria, which was really, I think, an excellent pairing to give that more kind of, I guess, experiential context of that region. And then the Axim Cape Coast, which is in the south, and the urban compound house, which is in Accra, also in the south of Ghana, and then the Ejusubisiase Shrine House, which I look at in more detail, which is in the center of the country, and is sort of, in a different climatic zone. And the reason, so yeah, I guess part of that exercise was really to sort of try to unpack what the specific attributes of a compound house were or are, and how they have like manifested differently in each type. So I guess there was this kind of, yeah, and I think this also goes back to this relationship with what public actually means. So there is this notion of like a home being this private space, but actually in reality there's it's a microcosm of what happens in the public sphere. So I think why the compound house is so relevant is because it does produce these hierarchies of or thresholds of private and public space, and how the home also needs to have this like space, like kind of microcosm of a public space within it, which is what the courtyard offers and the veranda, and then it kind of transitions into the private room, which again I would encourage everybody to also read Flash's article, because I think it really adds another layer of understanding to this typology. And yeah, I guess the in relation to things like policy and the economy of a place, I think what was really relevant is to understand how this is something that is developed through a notion of trying to be efficient and thinking about things like land value and how to cater for growing families, etc., which has historically been really embedded and has helped evolve the compound house, but is I would argue was part of the original. And then I guess this notion of it really being about conveying a collective sense of identity, which I talk about more in the CSC Shrine House. And I think the reason why I picked this case study was really to allow me to look at the house from a different perspective. So this being a house for a god, rather than for, I guess, the extent, like how the so also the CSC Shrine House is one of the only remaining remnants of this like amazing erased heritage of Ghana, the Ashanti Kingdom. I guess the kind of reason to look at it through the lens of it not just being a human habitat, but something like a kind of notion of a culture feeling like a home. It can also be created for a god and a higher deity, and these higher deities, as well as the extension of them, which are human. And also to look at the spiritual layer, I think, of this community specifically, and how they embedded that into their architecture. So I talk a lot about the Adinkra symbols, which communicate non-verbally, like a continuation of the kind of oral history that is part of the culture. And then I think it was really important for me to bring in my own kind of lived experience of the compounds, I think really to situate how places affect people. I mean, in this instance, obviously, specifically from my own experiences, but in order to really express like why this typology is important, specifically to members of the African diaspora, but also to an African context, and also to show how then that manifests itself in our practice, which is really about like generating a new framework for thinking about housing. So both, I think, in the Ghanaian context, but also for people from the African diaspora, and how important the house or the spaces of the house are to culture and living. And of course, like confronted by COVID and thinking about the home on a daily basis, or being surrounded by the home on a daily basis, it's really kind of evoked a lot of thoughts on what it means for the future of housing. I think I'll stop there and pass over to Manijeh and Maddie.
Thank you so much, Bushra.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just share screen 1 second. It's quite a nice handover with your pavilion in Venice.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Into another. Yeah.
Oh, it's perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much for having us. We really enjoyed writing our article for this, which was called Powers of Public Space. And as Maria said, we had quite a unique experience with the British Pavilion, because we were commissioned to do the project sort of pre-pandemic. And then due to the pandemic, the whole project got delayed. And so we were grappling with this topic of public space that we've been exploring for a number of years, and suddenly exploring it in a brand new way through the pandemic. And the article was a really fantastic way, I think, for us to sort of consolidate a lot of the ideas we've been developing over the course of the project. So yeah, I think we really want to thank you for inviting us to contribute, and we'll take you through some of the ideas behind our article. I suppose Powers of Public Space, it sort of explores our contribution to the British Pavilion at Venice Architecture Biennale, which is really looking at public space as the sort of stage on which the city's life is played out, and how the pandemic started to highlight the importance of accessible public spaces, and has sort of allowed us this opportunity to have a real conversation and dialogue about how we can open up our privatised public space. And so with the Garden of Privatised Delights, we're sort of looking at different themes around privatised public space, and transformed the 6 rooms of the pavilion into different. We invited room designers to take each of the 6 rooms and transform them into a different type of privatised public space, and really explore through a central installation in that room how we can rethink that type of public space to open it up, to be more accessible, to be welcoming to everyone. So we're exploring everything from the future of the pub to the high streets, to access to green spaces for young people, and then also looking at legislation and policy around sort of land ownership and ownership of data. And I suppose it was really important to us to be grappling with all these different scales, from everything from sort of a detail or a sense of touch within a space right the way up to that scale of legislation and policy, to really understand how we can rethink these spaces. And so when we began working on this project together, I suppose something we found quite interesting was the polarization of how people view privatized public space. And it was really important to us to have a tool to allow us to delve further into the murkiness of this conversation and bring lots of different people around the table together to understand that we need to engage in the kind of complexities around privatized public space. And that tool for us really became this painting by Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which uses the form of a triptych to show the utopia of the Garden of Eden on the left, the dystopia of hell on the right, and the framing of this middle ground of earth as the subject of the painting at the centre. And so to start developing our concept, we uninhabited Bosch's painting to reveal how devoid of interest and life generic green space in cities can be, without any signs of inhabitation such as people and programming. And this was quite a stark moment for us, I think. And then we sort of re-inhabited the painting with our own interpretation, The Garden of Privatised Delights. And this translates the 3 panels into the utopia of the commons before the Enclosures Act of the 18th century on the left, then the dystopia of total privatisation on the right, and then this middle ground, which addresses the issue of privatised public space, which is the space we're all living in. And so essentially we want to challenge this polarization of public and private, and rethink how we can create sort of more inclusive and accessible spaces. And the idea was, as you're entering the pavilion, you're sort of entering into that middle panel. And so there's a great deal of nostalgia for a time when the state sort of funded public space. And this book by Brett Christophers, which looks at the fire sale of public land by the British government over the last few decades without public knowledge, became really kind of core to the different themes we were exploring around this topic. And it really led us to question what it really means for a space to be publicly owned, and what it sort of means for a space to be truly accessible to all. And then another project which really helped us to understand the scale of the issue of land ownership is this map by Guy Shrubsole and Anna Powell-Smith, which is part of a wider research project called Who Owns England? It's also a website you can go and look at. And it's sort of, they basically use this mapping to give a greater transparency over ownership of land. So they've mapped who owns all the land in England and Wales according to the Land Registry's website. And it's quite shocking because when they started the project, only 50% of all land was actually documented on the Land Registry's website. So that meant 50% of land, even though it might be privately owned, it wasn't clear who actually owned that land. And now it's 85%. So that means that there's still 5.2 million acres that's not registered. And even when that land is registered, as you can see on the right, like it's often not attributed to a particular owner. So there's a real lack of transparency over who owns the land that we're all walking on.
So I guess the opportunity to contribute to AA files meant that we could jump off from the 6 spaces we were exploring in the pavilion. And because we were kind of grappling also with the global pandemic, which, as Maddie said previously, like actually highlighted a lot of these issues and made them even more urgent, we thought for our contribution, we'd look at Powers of Public Space, which was a play on the kind of potential of these spaces, but also a kind of inspired by the kind of multi-scalar Powers of 10 project by Charles and Ray Eames. And in their film, as they like kind of span from the cosmos straight down to the kind of molecular scale, this kind of 10 to the power of 0 scale was the human scale. And we were quite interested in how public space exists across scales, and then what it means to kind of live and occupy and inhabit them, but also who has access to these spaces. So in our article, we look at 3 different types of public space. We look at the rewilding of the golf course and the opening up of golf courses during the pandemic. We look at the space of the street and how that was opened up as well as a space where we could safely gather and inhabit in different ways. And we also look at the library as a really important civic space that maybe we haven't had as much access to during the pandemic because of so many libraries being closed and them being really reliant on volunteer support. We were inspired to look at the golf course, this links back to the project Maddie mentioned before on Who Owns England. And Guy Shrubsole started a petition during the pandemic to open up golf courses. And you can see on this map, all of the red areas are golf courses in and around London, and they take up such a huge percentage of green space. And the number of golfers, I think, has gone down by 20,000 over the last several years, yet the number of golf courses we have remained the same. And there were really interesting case studies of where these spaces were opened up, all the different types of activities that were able to happen there. So we thought that was really interesting to explore in terms of why we have all of this space that people can't access. And then we also looked at play streets and the creation of play streets and how important they are in terms of providing a space where different generations can come together. This is an example that Europa did in Harrow Road, in Station Road in Harrow. But there's lots of interesting examples where communities got together and applied to create a play street, but often it's not clear like how anyone can do this. And so we wanted to use the article as well to kind of put together information on how you can go about this. And Christina really helped us kind of come up with ways to footnote the article in order to make sure that all of the research that's actually currently happening into these topics can all be like read by people reading AA files. And then the last space is the library. And we were really interested in how, I guess the UK's public library system has always been kind of struggling to catch up with the rest of Europe because it's never really been truly public and it's been really dependent on funding and volunteering. And so we were just looking at how much more than just a library all these spaces are as civic spaces in society, how so many people are dependent on them for the internet or to combat loneliness, for like as a help desk. And so there were so many interesting things that kind of come through the library that we wanted to explore in our article. So yeah, I guess that's a kind of quick summary of what we've done. And in terms of the pavilion, while it feels like it went by in a bit of a blur, and a lot of people didn't get to go to Venice, the British Council's website, which this is a screenshot of, has a lot of information and a kind of virtual tour that you can go on to experience it. And hopefully in the coming months, it's going to return to the UK and be exhibited here. So we hope that a lot of people that weren't able to travel out to Venice can come and interact and enjoy it. And I think our article ends with this quote by Jane Jacobs, which was actually something we had in our competition entry when applying to curate the British Pavilion, which is that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And it was really important to us that this topic of like what is public gets discussed and debated more, and that we really open up these spaces for everyone to kind of inhabit, access, and decide how they're used. So I guess we can stop there.
Great, thank you, Maddie and Manijeh. I think that it was really great for me to hear actually from your own voice, actually, what you see in the essay, because of course we've had a conversation throughout these months and I know what I see in the essay, but obviously hearing it from the authors is always different. And I think something that comes out pretty clearly to me actually when your two files actually are put together, including of course the other contributions that are in the respective files, so Flashes and Calvin's, is that bizarrely, these two files together, to me, are more clear on the question of the commons than many attempts that we had in the past to try to actually describe the commons actually, straight on, or processes of commoning, I would say, rather than the commons. Because it's really actually in this crack between actually what is private and what is public, what is state and what is actually individual agency, that we find actually ways to describe maybe like in a negative way, if you want, actually what are the commons. I hope in the next issues actually we are going to have more files dedicated actually to the commons. But to me already actually the contrast between these two presentations makes it pretty clear that it's quite urgent to actually revise this very, very thin but rigid line that we have nowadays defining what is private and what is public. And I would say actually that if there is another word actually that binds to me, for me actually together the two research experiences of Bushra on the one hand and Madi and Manijeh on the other hand, is really enclosure. That has been somehow the most powerful tool that the West, especially Europe, but let's say the colonial West, has invented to draw very precise lines between man and community, and often actually between the family and society, and so on and so forth. And so enclosure really has become, to me, almost like the most totalizing, if you want, actually architectural tool that has worked at all scales. It starts with the scale of the house, even almost like with the scale of the room, I would say, as Bushra explains actually really well in her essay. And then it goes on to the scale of the division between actually the private realm and the public realm, and so on and so forth. And I think both contributions really show us how this division that is so rigid is still very much actually what we work within, especially in Europe or in the UK, but it's been challenged. It's been challenged actually by a new generation that is increasingly, I would say, really fed up, if you want, actually, with this type of imposition, if you want, cultural imposition, that is very often extremely artificial. So I hope that all of you will read actually Bushra's essay. But I think the thing that stayed with me the most actually out of her essay is this really bold, I would say, a really really bold statement that says, it's high time really that the colonizers start to welcome, if you want, actually ideas or ways of looking at the world that are the ways of looking at the world that they repressed. Because if we were able actually finally to acknowledge that even in actually countries that have been colonizers like the UK, in fact, actually these countries are by now actually multicultural, they should in fact acknowledge these other ways of understanding categories such as, for instance, home and public and so on and so forth. Then I think that's only from this that a new actually debate on what are the commons and what life is really at large would be meaningful again. And I thought that this was really important because we talk a lot about actually, the colonizing the curriculum and so on and so forth, but it's actually extremely difficult to let go of these categories that as Western architects actually we've been taught. And I would really say that the first one for me is really private and public. And that's something that for me actually both essays do in a very, very clear way. So, I mean, they really question assumptions that we use every day when we design that we teach our students unconsciously, I would say also many times. So I would just be curious to ask you guys actually two questions maybe. One that is that has to do more with content, let's say, and of course, it's a very general question, and it's maybe also a silly question, but it's a question which I think we have to ask ourselves. If you see any possible strategies to come out of this condition of enclosure in which the culture of colonization and capitalism has put us in the last couple of centuries. Of course, it's the big question, right, that we all face, but I would be curious to hear what is your perspective on that. And the other is more of a method question, if you want, because I think it's interesting that your essays actually show us also ways in which scholarship can approach these topics from a perspective that is perhaps non-traditional or non-traditional from an academic point of view. In Bushra's case, I'm referring particularly to two things. First of all, the fact actually, Bushra, that you use really your tools as a designer, that you redrew the plans of these houses, that you really engaged in a close reading, that is a close reading that I would say is not a close reading of a critic, it's a close reading of an architect, more specifically really of a designer. And the second thing is, of course, the fact that you put into play also your personal experience, which I think is extremely important because it's something that we hardly ever acknowledge actually as designers. But I do think that if all of us were able to kind of almost like, analyze our spatial experience, starting from what we experience as children and so on and so forth, we would be able to learn so much more of the way actually we then design spaces for others, in fact. And in the case of Maddie and Manijeh, of course, it's their curatorial experience. So it's the way in which actually a curatorial experience can be far more than just producing cultural entertainment, I would say, but it becomes, in fact, an occasion to do research, to produce research that has a long-lasting impact that goes beyond the few months of the installation. And that, in fact, starting from this article goes on, but of course, with your future publications and so on and so forth, goes on actually to impact the debate in a more long-lasting way. So in a way, I think all the three of you, in a way, use the tools that are not kind of the traditional tools of scholarship that are normally, reading books, reading secondary literature, sitting down and writing. But you really put at play things like, constructing three-dimensional experiences, curating exhibitions, drawing, designing, and even storytelling, actually. And so I would like to hear from you really these two things. How do you see the way out of the enclosure, and how do you see your practice as a new method, in fact, actually, for producing architectural knowledge?
Manijeh, Maddie, do you want to go first, or are you happy?
Don't mind. Go for it, Bushra.
Don't mind.
I feel like let's not be speaking to the void. Let's have a conversation. I can start with that first question. I mean, I think, Maddie, you touched on this, and Manijeh, with policy, I guess, and legislation being a lot of the answer. So one of the key aims with the research is to eventually kind of tease out a set of policies or I guess, I think that what's really important, and as you talk about me using my tools as an architect, is I think that I've learned a language in a way so Bell Hooks writes really well about this, and I'm not going to be as eloquent as her, but in a way it's about using I guess she calls it the oppressor's language, and I don't feel oppressed by architecture, but it is the language that I've learned to speak with. And so I am going to continue to use the language in order for everybody to understand, in a way, what we're saying. So by saying that, I mean that it wouldn't be proactive for me to all of a sudden start speaking it in a different language in order to get something done architecturally, right? So I think that policy is a tool that we have that we can understand and we can influence. So it feels like the right strategy, and also to approach it as a designer, as an architect, as somebody who has agency in how these things like our housing places that we live, or that at least I think we should have agency. Of course, that agency has deteriorated over time, but I think it's also partly deteriorated only if we let it, right? So to kind of continue to take charge of our agency as architects to affect policy when it comes to our built environment and our landscapes. So that's how I guess I would approach. We're trying to approach that element of our practice, and continue to use the tools that we've been taught. So by that I mean architectural convention to communicate. And then my personal experience, I guess. Why I think it's really important to bring in personal experience in a way as a sort of pedagogical tool as well, because I feel like in architecture we are taught that architecture is this final truth, and so bias and personal experience cannot interfere with it. But I feel like at least the last 2 years, what it's taught us is that bias explicitly controls architecture and what is produced, and has historically affected a lot of architecture that has failed and succeeded in different ways. But the bias is so inherent to that. So I think that it's really important for me to come or to be very honest about my influences, right? And how I approach design based on my own bias and my own influences. And I think that I see that being owned maybe by or I was taught in a way that I felt that was being owned by a certain category of architect, and then being sort of almost like allowed to, because that bias was the status quo and the kind of main narrative that could permeate and influence this truth that we talked about architecture and things like the canon, etc. But it didn't. I couldn't see it coming from anyone who was on the periphery and who was on the margins, let's say. And I think that something, I would say, since my part two, my master's, I felt like more and more agency to just say no. That I think the margins should be able to also own that as an equal, an equal to that truth that is architecture, but also to challenge the truth, and to say that actually it's plural. That truth is very plural and layered and complex. And I mean, everything I'm saying is not original. It's just that it's about refocusing and recentering that perspective, so that one doesn't feel like, oh, actually, no, there's, so you don't lose this feeling of like, okay, there isn't actually a truth in architecture, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. That would be what I think.
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe pick up on that about the kind of the multiple truths and also different ways of reading the profession and understanding it, and to pick up on something that Maria, you said earlier about like private and public. Like, so obviously for Maddie and I, we, through using the painting as a useful tool, we were trying to break this binary between those two. But like Bushra, in your article, I thought it was really interesting your personal story and relationship to the compound house, and then your move to the UK, and how I guess in Kenya, the compound house in general is a much more public space, and this kind of differentiation between the home as a private space and public space doesn't really, like, it's much blurrier there. And like, I think there's so much to learn from that, like the fact that there are gradients of publicness and privateness that in most spaces, like even in the UK, like the pub for us began as people opening up their living rooms to the public. And I always think back to when we started doing this new canonical histories lecture series at the AA, Leslie Loco gave one of the first lectures in the series, and she talked about how in most African languages there's no words for public and private. And so like, how can you expect that people would practice architecture in the exact same way, especially the profession that's predicated on these kinds of concepts, when these words don't even exist? And so I think there's a lot we have to undo in terms of how how the West has dominated a kind of definition of architecture and this division or this binary of private and public. And I think that, I think that's what's so interesting about this pairing. But I think I think your article, though it's in a home file, it's actually really setting up a really interesting argument for the public file that follows. And questioning what is public.
Yeah, another reason to really situate my own personal experience was really this notion that I have been exposed to both, right? And at a younger age, when things like memory and nostalgia and that kind of way of thinking about space and place really starts to kind of blur what the reality is as well. So I think that was also kind of important that I think many more people have moved from different places and are moving, and the world is much more global. So it's not about this like fixed notion of what an architecture and space is, but that there's like a necessary change that needs to happen because of the fluidity we have now globally, as a result of things like colonization and industrial revolution, etc.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well, your reading of these spaces as an architect as well, and how you sort of take the tools that you've kind of gathered as an architect and apply them in different ways. And I think that's something that the AA in general is actually really good at doing, is kind of questioning the role of the architects and how we take our skills and start to use them and apply them in different contexts and circumstances to really draw out what we can do. And that was definitely something as well we were trying to do with the pavilion, was really exploring the role of the architect as a communicator, as someone who can bring lots of different people around the table. And often, like when you're working in architecture practice or something, you're just surrounded by other people with the exact same skill set as you, and you kind of forget actually where our strengths are in our education, and how good we can be at understanding space, how good we are actually at reading these spaces and these places in the city, and at the importance of sort of communicating that outside of our own kind of sphere and our own worlds. And bringing in different kind of groups and people from different backgrounds and contexts all together to really understand how we can start to redefine these places and these spaces. And then I guess as well, just with the pavilion, like from the outset, we did always see this as a project that was much more than just the British Pavilion. And I think this sort of even came from in the competition phase, where we spent the whole competition thinking there was no way we're going to win this. So we were doing a competition almost as a way to just explore this idea that we thought we'd then take elsewhere. And I think, in fact, what happened was that sort of came through in the competition, that this kind of idea around privatized public space that we're trying to explore, it's much more than just it being about this one exhibition. It's something that we've been exploring for a number of years together through different workshops and summer schools and stuff. And it's something that we want to continue to explore sort of for decades to come. And as a result, that was why the exhibition in part was designed as this series of installations that can then be reappropriated in different public spaces around the UK. It was also, I think, thinking about the role of the architect and bringing different people together was also one of the reasons why from the outset we were like, we don't want loads of text and images on the walls. We want this to be a place that anyone from any background, any age can come in, enter the pavilion, interact with, and start to understand public space, start to read the spaces around them differently when they leave the pavilion. That it's really somewhere you don't have to have a very high level of architectural education to understand, but we do have, like an accompanying guide or accompanying catalogue for those who want to delve further. And I was really thinking about those different kinds of experiences that people might have to engage that wider audience, to then be able to have that discussion and really take it to the next level, I suppose, going forwards. Because I think something we'd really noticed was, when you have a lot of discussions just within the architectural community, there's only so far that you can go with them, and there's only so much change you can make. Whereas when you bring lots of different people on board, in fact, we also found that a lot of the time you have very aligned visions, like, an evil developer and public sector, actually, local community group, there can be very aligned visions of people wanting a piece of city to be more successful and allow more people in. But if everyone's just operating in these silos and talking in different kinds of languages, nothing really happens. So it was how we as architects could sort of bring all that conversation together to really rethink our public spaces and make meaningful change.
Great. Thank you all so much. We will have time actually to go back to these themes maybe at the end, but I want to thank all the three of you actually for these really thought-provoking actually observations. Yeah, we have so many things to say, but okay, let's go to the next trio. Let me just share my screen a second so that I can introduce actually our next guest. Where am I here? And actually, this time the two themes that I would like to discuss with these three authors are environment and territory. Obviously, they are two themes or two keywords, if you want, actually, that we could read as almost like the same term, or almost like one the opposite of the other, in the sense that one is normally perceived as being something that has to do more with quote unquote nature, and the other one with a constructed character, in fact, actually of that nature. The three guests actually that we have here tonight are Thandi Loewenson, Elisa Iturbe, and David Burns. So Thandi teaches at the Royal College of Art and is also visiting professor at the Aarhus School of Architecture. She's the co-founder of the architectural collective Breakline. And I think very interestingly, I think for our audience, she's also a co-curator of the open access curriculum project racespacearchitecture.org that I would invite all of you actually to check out online. Then we have Elisa. Elisa was also in the same file as Thandi, the environment file. Elisa teaches at the Cooper Union in New York, and she's also a critic at the Yale School of Architecture. And she is also co-founder of the firm Outside Development. So she's both a teacher and a designer, much like Thandi. David Burns is the head of media studies at the Royal College of Art, the School of Architecture of the Royal College of Art. He's also co-founder of the N Curatorial Collective and the Fiction Feeding Frame Research Collective, of which also Thandi is a member and founder. And I think most notably, actually, David was inaugural director of photography and situated media at the University of Technology, Sydney, which I think is a relevant part of his curriculum because as we will see, his contribution to this issue centered very much around actually his practice as a photographer. So I would leave the floor now to Thandi, then Elisa, and then David to discuss actually this couple of terms, territory and environment.
Is it me? Am I up? Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, what an honor, what a gift to be in this in the company of these incredible writers in this publication. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Christina and Maria. Thank you for your patience, especially. But I also want to say just how enjoyable it was working with you. I don't think I've ever smiled at track changes, let alone laughed out loud at them. So I just really appreciate and big up yourselves for that as a process. I'm going to share my screen. Let me share just part of it. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so the piece, as Maria very kindly introduced, is titled A Stratigraphy of Lusaka, and borrows from the term stratigraphy, or the practice of stratigraphy, which is to kind of excavate the ground and analyze what it is that you find there. And so I'm going to be reading a bit from the text and kind of interjecting into a little bit, so bear with me. But I start with this provocation that Lusaka's ground is full of holes. So here, these are sites in the city where something or something different should be, which abound, denying the clarity and the certainty in the present that a physical encounter with the past brings. In this text, instead of reading these holes as absence and vacuum, I seek to rather engage in a close reading of the contours of these openings, to determine the matter which fills these voids, and to understand, as M. Norbisi Philip calls us to do, how our lives are in turn shaped by negative space, by the surrounding emptiness around which we as African people grow. This piece is a very personal one. I actually originally started it when I was talking to a really good friend, Bongani Kona, who's just produced an anthology on loss, which he was putting together during the kind of height of the pandemic, if we can still call it that. And as is the way with writing, sometimes planets align and sometimes they just will not align. And so this ended up not being in an anthology on loss and found, I think, a much happier home in this fantastic collection. And I'm actually quite delighted about this because, as you will see, in thinking I was writing about loss, I think I was actually writing about quite the opposite. So the piece is a series of excavations over a number of holes that I encountered in Lusaka over a period of a few years, from about 2015 to 2019, when I was actually desperately trying to find something solid, something that I could hold on to. And writing, as with researching, as with excavation, digging into the earth, I think, is in itself a kind of time travel in which layers of the past, present, and future are disturbed in the process. Here, what has been no longer is as it was, and is now something other, something new, and something in the process of being remade through enormous pressure and force, of which those of us who trip on the surface rarely have any clue. So fittingly then, this essay moves somewhat anarchically through time, We're at once in the long now of geological formation. We're at once in the 70s in newly independent Zambia, and then a few decades later during the economic, social, and epistemic violence of structural adjustment, which then became austerity, while also meandering down Cairo Road in the passenger seat of a taxi in 2018. Somehow, we were then, when I submitted the piece, also in 2021, having just buried Kenneth Kaunda, who you see here, president of Zambia from 1964 to 1991. And in the words of the writer and critic Percy Jomoya, the last surviving symbol of the era of high nationalism in Southern Africa. Lusaka's ground is full of holes. Katangan metasedimentary rock meeting Precambrian granitic matter, which is subject to the machinations of the near atmosphere, humidity, precipitation, flooding, and pressure, and the influence of our lunar and solar interstellar companions, heat, light, wind, gravity, dark matter, which has all resulted in formations of ground and earth of almost impossible complexity. Rumors abound of another series of excavations, a series of secret underground tunnels and bunkers built between 1974 and 1976 by Energo project engineers sent to Zambia by former Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito, a close friend of then President Kaunda. The Energo project engineers had been publicly contracted to help construct a number of projects, most notably above the ground, in preparation for the 1970 summit of the non-aligned movement. So most notably, these included the Mulungushi International Conference Center, which is an incredible, incredible building, which you see here, built to host the proceedings, and Findeco House, which is also quite an incredible building and which remains Zambia's tallest building today. Lusaka's ground is full of holes, and the piece takes us to the home of holes in the city too, to Leopard's Hill Cemetery, where I am in search of the tombstone of the grave site of Edward Festus Makuka Nkoloso, former freedom fighter and originator of the independence-era Zambian space program. Despite the support of the city's grave diggers, we never find his grave, and instead I just encounter more holes, holes where coffins have been disinterred and former freedom fighters have made it home to countries of which only dreams existed when they had died: South Africa, Mozambique, and my home, Zimbabwe. Lusaka's ground is full of holes. Holes and holes and more holes. And at the Chunga landfill, we find its biggest hole yet. A huge mass of 10 years of city waste, which the city has been struggling to maintain. But despite appearances, bear with me. But despite appearances, this hole is far from the low end. Workers, members of the Chunga Waste Recyclers Association, have reconfigured the material, metaphysical, and social rules that they have been dealt, organizing and crafting resistance, as well as imaginative projects which contend with injustice. So the piece is an unfolding and somewhat meditative, but also somewhat chaotic journey of all of these holes. And in reading the contours of these holes, we find something quite the opposite of absence. In M. Norbisi Phillips' terms, instead of the emptiness of holes, we find black holes. There is a multitude of wholeness, thick with matter, meaning, and relation, which helps us to understand our relationships to complicated and contested political pasts, especially in Southern Africa, and what remains to be read from these holes for those of us who trip the surface today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can leave the floor to Elisa, maybe.
Yes, I'm just unmuting myself. And let me open up my screen. Okay, sorry, I apologize for the glaring sunlight. Because of the pandemic, I'm not at home, and because of the very domestic structures that shape this place that I'm at, I don't have a quiet place to Zoom, so I'm Zooming from the garden of privatized delights. Okay, so I want to start by thanking Maria and Christina for the opportunity to write this essay. As Maria mentioned, for the past few years, my research has focused on the relationship between energy and architectural form, and I've been using the term carbon form. And so the research really focuses on understanding the spatial expression of our current carbon-intensive energy regime, which is based on fossil fuels and which is also at the heart of the climate breakdown that we're experiencing. But the argument that I've been trying to make is that upon the adoption of fossil fuels, a new spatial paradigm has emerged, and that we as architects have to understand that. Otherwise, we are going to have very little agency in this matter at all. Or if anything, we will simply continue to make it worse. So this is an essay that looks at the prehistory of carbon form, in a sense, and it comes from a desire to dive into the history of energy transition. And because the argument that I'm making is very much based on the notion of energy transition, the fact that the adoption of fossil fuels provided it for us a turning point in history. So I felt like I had to really understand the history of energy transition better. And so this is historical material that has truly become essential to my own thinking about energy and its relationship to architecture. So I'm very grateful to Maria for giving me the opportunity to write this and work through some of these ideas. So the basic notion of this relationship between architecture and energy transition and the importance of fossil fuels. Of course, like with most things, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that things were not so simple. And it's not simply that fossil fuels were adopted and boom, everything changed. It's, of course, much more nuanced. So this essay has two main aspects to it. The first is a historical component where I really try to understand those histories of energy transition and make sense of what is changing and what is energy transition is really one of the fundamental questions of this text. And then the second aspect of the essay is really to attempt to briefly theorize some of the implications of what I have found, at least in terms of what the implications are for architecture and how we think about architecture at this time. So in terms of history, my point of departure is this, which is our typical narrative of energy transition, which is a notion that we can define energy transition through changing techniques of energy capture. Energy capture simply meaning how we get energy to reproduce our daily lives. Not just humans, but all organisms engage in this. But when we think about the history of human society, it's often argued that we've gone through three paradigms of energy, or three systems of energy capture, and that's how we can kind of break down human history. And that in hunter-gatherer society, we largely moved out into the environment to retrieve energy, mostly in the form of food, although of course this included also gathering wood for fuel and for heat, etc. Then when we shift to an agricultural paradigm, we begin to cultivate those resources in place. And that is a significant change in our relationship to energy. And then, of course, the final energy transition occurs when we move into the use of fossil fuels because we're extracting energy resources from beneath the ground. And then that energy transition is important not only because of the change in where we are getting the energy, but also because at that point, industrialization has begun. And so we're harnessing energy for production in totally new ways. So this is a kind of basic scaffold that I begin with, but a large part of the essay, the bulk of it, is really dedicated to complicating this timeline. And I do that by looking at the history of each transition more closely and asking what is truly changing here and what is the source of rupture in each case. And what I realized is that at stake is the very notion of rupture itself. And I realized that changes in energy capture cannot be the sole way that we think about energy transition. And that's particularly important right now because we are trying to usher in a new energy transition that could not be more urgent. And yet our concepts around energy transition are sadly narrow. They tend to really focus only just on changes of energy capture. And really what we hear largely in architecture especially is just the switch to renewables being the energy transition. But so I wanted to look at energy transition via different lenses aside from energy capture. And I found that depending on what you looked at, rupture could occur in different places. So if you think about energy density, then which is just simply a term that refers to how much energy you get from sort of like a cubic amount of the energy source. In that case, fossil fuels are radically different from everything that came before. Hunter-gatherer and agricultural societies both used what's called surface biomass. And in that case, they were more similar to each other than to the industrial paradigm. And so that's one way of perhaps thinking that there's some continuity in the previous two energy paradigms, and then reinforces this idea that the shift to industry is a very radical break. However, as I started looking more then into the transition into agriculture, the first energy transition, I realized that there was something really radical that happened there too. And in that case, it was the shift from a subsistence economy to a surplus economy. And that meant that we started to engage in a level of energy extraction that was unprecedented in hunter-gatherer society. And so when you look at the timeline through this lens, then in that case, the truly radical break happens in the shift from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian one, when you start to have these practices of extraction and of energy harnessing that are totally involved in these political and social structures, in civilization building projects, let's say, which means that there you can see a sort of stronger sense of continuity between an agrarian paradigm and an industrial one, and the radical break happens to appear to be in the first energy transition. So this is a more complicated visualization of these different timelines relative to each other, but where you can really see that the ruptures are offset from each other. So I'm carrying down the lines from the first timeline of energy capture just to show that in the other two, where the rupture occurs is actually off, and it is kind of occurring different places in the timeline. So the essay kind of grapples with this, and I'm not going to get into all of that right now. But I found that there were two major lessons. And one is that energy transition is not just about a change in techniques of energy capture. This first timeline is just absolutely insufficient for really thinking about what energy transition is. And that actually energy transition is more about a change in what sociologist Mimi Scheller calls an energy culture, which she defines as assemblages of matter, energy, practices, and meanings. So I think that it's by looking at those assemblages that the true nature of an energy regime emerges, and that the true nature of a transition also becomes more apparent. And then the second lesson that I learned in looking at all of this, and that the essay gets into, is that architecture is heavily implicated in all of this. And it may not seem like I've been talking about architecture much up to this point, but actually, as I looked at every single one of these energy transitions, I found that architecture was really at the center of each one. Sometimes for the most simple reason that architecture is often the reason why energy is harnessed as we shift into a different paradigm. And so in terms of thinking about an energy transition, and in terms of thinking about energy cultures in a broader and more complex lens, what I'm really arguing is that part of understanding a transition is understanding that the ends for which energy is harnessed matters. So a simple technological shift will not be sufficient to usher in a true change in our energy culture and our energy regime. It may simply be a way of intensifying the existing paradigm, which is something that actually is what we've seen with the adoption of renewables up until this point. We simply consume more energy because we have more energy sources. So we haven't seen any sort of significant transition so far at all. But to go back to the notion of architecture, for me, this last timeline of the shift from subsistence economies to surplus economies really was fundamental to changing the way that I think about energy and architecture, and to really help me to get outside of the typical notion that the link between architecture and energy is about energy consumption, about the energy use of a building. It's not just about building systems. Because as you can see in this final timeline, the shift from subsistence to surplus happens, it's not aligned with the first timeline where you see hunter-gatherers shifting to agriculture. And that's because the adoption of agricultural techniques happened 4,000 years before the onset of the city-state, which is where we really start to see societies truly organizing themselves around an agrarian structure. And so the shift to a hunter-gatherer to an agrarian paradigm, in my mind, doesn't occur simply when people start cultivating food. For 4,000 years, those techniques of cultivation were mixed with other gathering and hunting techniques. But it's really with the origin of the city and the rise of the city-state that we start to see society truly reorient itself around agriculture, because you needed the energy to be harnessed and to be extracted to create the city-state itself. And so architecture was at the heart of that because of the temple complex. And I draw a lot from the archaeologist Mario Liverani, who writes about Mesopotamia and its early histories and the rise of the city-state. But what becomes really apparent is that architecture is at the center of this energy transition. As an act of construction, it provides the material core of an assemblage of matter and energy and labor. But it's also an instrument of state formation, which is a continuity that we see today. Today, we have the act of building, acts of construction, acts of architecture to be the building block of contemporary economies and the object of power itself. So the essay then ends by trying to rethink the notion of rupture on the terms that we usually use in architecture. And those terms that we tend to use are really about transgression and the avant-garde. And these are not timeless notions, right? They're historically specific ones. And I think they have to be rethought in the context of energy transition. Because what you see in these timelines and in the role that architecture plays in each of them is that architecture has in the past participated in an overturning of an existing world order. But my argument ultimately is that architecture has not always done so in a good way. And actually, the moment that we think of in architecture as the most important rupture historically is modernism. And yet, for me, in terms of doing these histories of carbon form, I think that the onset of modernism in architecture is really about finishing a project of overturning a previous world order that had already started with colonialism and early capitalism and the rise of industry, all of which began before the adoption of fossil fuels. So all of this is to say that the role of architecture is undeniable. But it's not always necessarily a good thing. And so for me, the knowledge of that, I think, should help us to reframe what is a radical and a revolutionary architecture in our time. And so the second or the last part of the essay really tries to go into that by talking about the difference between what I call passive carbon form and active carbon form. And in terms of thinking about the relationship between energy and form, this is to say that, of course, there are moments where the architectural form that we produce and the urban form that we produce sometimes is just resultant of certain kind of processes. And I think you see that in early industry, where there wasn't necessarily, let's say, a strong notion of what urban form should be, as much as just there was this kind of influx of people into the city because of the enclosure movement, of course, as we discussed, and then the onset of industry. And there's a kind of sort of resultant nature to some of that form. And you see that still today with the economies of real estate as they are. They produce these kinds of carbon forms that just kind of replicate themselves without an overarching architectural project. But then in the middle of this timeline, there's this moment of modernism where architecture actively dedicates itself to giving form to this industrial paradigm. So my point is not that sort of an active modality of form is actually better or worse, because in this case, modernity reified carbon form in a way that made, I think, the process of industrialization irreversible in a totally new way. But it's just to recognize that architecture does have an extraordinary amount of power. And I'd like to say that against the trend of saying that architecture is powerless, which is very popular to say, especially in the US context. And I'd like to point that out, not to sort of have an aggrandized sense of what architecture is, but to recognize that any architecture that seeks to address the climate crisis has to work against that power. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, share my screen. Is that visible? Yes, okay. Thank you so much. You know, I have to mirror my dear friend Thandi by saying also I want to thank you for your patience, Maria, with the process of writing the article and getting it to you. So thank you very much. It's a real honor to be in the new issue of Files, and of course also to join all these amazing people today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'll be speaking about tonight, and to pay respects to elders past and future. My article for Files focuses on the colonial violence of refusal evidenced in a place called Maralinga, South Australia, which was the site of the British nuclear weapons testing in the 1950s and 60s. Specifically, the article is, I could say, kind of an autoethnographic tracing of these forces through the act of personally moving across the land, of going from one place to Maralinga, navigating the overlays of extractivist technologies and policies, and primarily kind of acknowledging and witnessing and being evidence to the long colonial influence that infrastructure has played in the Australian continent. And the article is coupled, the short article is coupled with a series of my own photographs. But of course, what these photographs don't disclose or can't disclose is the evidence of the Cold War trauma that Maralinga experienced. And what remains in those images, and yet kind of frustratingly unseen, is what Joseph Masco calls the multi-millennial colonization of the future, right? The product of years of the atomic testing and research, invisible in these photographs, but also still present and essentially eternal. That the evidence of that is now interred in burial pits, or it's vitrified in glass tombs, or it's hidden in plain sight as seemingly harmless rocks and sand. So Maralinga, in some ways, has become this reluctant archive of nuclear futures imaginaries. And its past is the result of politics of repeated and layered forms of colonialism and environmental destruction. But that's now buried underfoot, defying my camera or any other camera. The path to get to Maralinga begins with one of the first extraordinary moments of transcontinental infrastructure in Australia, which is the air highway, which is part of Highway 1, which crosses the continent from east to west and west to east. And the construction of this around the turn of the 20th century was the moment in which kind of the newly federal Australia tied its most populous centers with its future economic center, which of course is the mineral-rich mining in the western part of the continent. And this road began as just a dirt track. In fact, it wasn't paved, or there was no bitumen on this land until the 40s and 50s. So the infrastructure in this part of Australia has been very rudimentary, and so the British arrival changed all of that, right? So when we think of this part of Australia, or maybe when we all think of all of Australia, we tend to think of these extremely flat landscapes, right? This sort of eternal horizon, this red earth and low brush. And that does exist, right? That is part of of what you see when you're there. But more importantly, this sort of landscape and this sort of trope of the Australian landscape is what is embedded in Australia, in white Australia's mind, as sort of this barren and empty and kind of voided terra nullius. These thoughts that have been these kind of stereotypes have been perpetuated since the beginning, since the invasion of Australia, and have been perpetuated through popular media, through movies, films, through books and songs. So part of my battle with going there, obviously I'm not Australian myself, but I lived there for quite a while. Part of my challenge was to also kind of confront my own colonial gaze and to kind of constantly challenge myself as to what I was thinking and how I was interpreting where we were. This land is home to the world's largest weapons testing range, which is called the Woomera Prohibited Area. That's what it's called now. But it's about 130,000 square kilometers of restricted land, roughly equivalent to the size of England. It still exists today. And this image, like several of the images in this collection taken with a just commercial drone, shows the sort of ambiguity of how that restricted land exists. So on the right side of the image would be normal land. On the left side of the image is highly restricted land. That's only designated by this highway. The stereotype of like the Australian red landscape is evidenced also in the lakes that you see when you're moving through and driving through this territory, this country. And on maps, we were recently talking about this. Maps of this land are often depicted on Google Maps or other commercial maps as being blue, right, as being water filled, but most of the lakes in this area, of course, are highly seasonally affected. So most of the time they exist as these vast red empty plains. So even with the research that we were doing before we went, we were still confronted with these things in which we thought, okay, there's a lake coming up. But no, of course, it's a dry riverbed, a dry lake bed. The infrastructure that I had been looking at via satellite maps and commercial Google Maps or things like this, you start to trace these lines that the British built through the outback, and they appear as these perfectly straight orthogonal cuts in the terrain. And when you get there, then you start to realize the foreignness of these strokes made on the landscape. Lines that were drawn with no sensitivity or even awareness of the disparate countries and languages that they were crossing or the song lines they were disrupting. In the distance in this image is the Nullarbor Plain, which is a couple 100,000 square kilometers of salt plain, of limestone plain, limestone plain, named by white so-called explorers as the Nullarbor, which just of course means no trees. But the indigenous Anangu, they called it Gundiri, which was bare like a bone. So they overlaid a kind of a skeletal meaning on this area, as opposed to just comparing it to a European or even British understanding of land has trees. So if there's no trees, we call this place no trees. So this road goes from the railway that I mentioned at the beginning. It goes up through the Nullarbor Plain, slowly rising, and it ends eventually here at the gate, the historic gate now of the Maralinga test ranges. This land now is, I was about to say back in the hands of the Maralinga Jerija, but that's to say that it was returned or that it was given back would be a misnomer, because this land is unceded land. But the land is controlled by an organization called the Maralinga Jerija, and now they, instead of closing it off or hiding the damage and kind of trauma that was done in this land, they've instead opened it up. So people like me or you or someone could apply to go and spend time there and get educated about what happened, and learn about the violence and the death and the disruption to this territory, and to see a distinctly non-Western way of acknowledging a trauma that was not their own. Right, even naming their group, the Maralinga Jerija, they have adopted the word Maralinga, which was a name given to this place by the British. So the photographs that I included in the text and the very short text kind of traces from the air highway up to this point, and from this point on, it's part of my extended research. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And I mean, I've seen these images so many times, but they still give me chills, I have to say. And unfortunately, actually, Thandi has to leave in about 10 minutes. So I would like to start maybe with a question that is addressed especially to her, but to all the three of you, because I mean, it touches also your practice, your photographic practice, David. But it really has to do with the instruments that we use actually when we do research, and specifically actually with the power of storytelling that is very evident both in David's work, but also in Thandi's work. And so maybe I would like to start with you actually, Thandi. How do you see actually your practice through a range of mediums, including actually writing, but a type of writing that is not the type of writing that is usually taught in school. And it's a type of writing that actually excavates into more layers that again go back actually to the personal background that also Bushra was in a way advocating for the mobilization of actually earlier. Sorry, I'm not going to make the question any longer because I think you know where I want to arrive.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such a super nice question. And thanks everyone else on this panel for such beautiful presentations. Yeah, gosh. I don't really know how to begin with this one. Maybe with a bit of an anecdote that so I spent, obviously I was doing a lot of work in Zambia and I spent a lot of time there, and as part of this work I was learning Nyanja, which is the language spoken in Lusaka. And maybe this comes back to a point that you made earlier, Bushra, as well, about the language that we speak with and the different kind of terms held within that. Sorry, Manijeh, it was you actually. You were talking about Leslie and Leslie's amazing talk. But yeah, so I was learning Nyanja as a means of trying to better communicate with people, but it just opened up all these huge worlds of understanding about how time is conceptualized differently, about the surface of the earth, the density of the atmosphere, and so on. And there was a really nice one. So many incredible terms that just opened up my thinking and my practice. One of which is the word Milo, which is a word for tomorrow, but it's also the same word for yesterday, so it means both, and you contextualize it, and depending on who you're speaking to and how you're speaking, the terms with which you use around that word. But another one is so I was trying to explain to people that I was an architect, but of course a particular kind of architect, and I thought, okay, I'll start by explaining that the person that designs buildings, and then I'll go on from there. And so I was asking, what's the word for to design a building, and several people I spoke to were like, no, there isn't really a word for that. Instead, the word that we use is to write a building, kulemba, nyumba, actually to write a home, which is really nice. Throw back to the previous panel. And so I think there's something quite amazing in that writing becomes this practice of construction, making, and a collective practice too, that isn't just done by one person, but involves kind of multitude of skills and knowledges of temporalities. And I think that's somehow reflective in this piece too, that in trying to encounter these particular geological formations or man-made formations, there is inherently a collective practice of research, a collective practice of kind of understanding history, and a practice of storytelling that involves a multitude of voices and a multitude of stories in order to read and understand a place, and in doing so to design and to make a place too. I suppose it's somehow written and at the same time very architectural as a practice. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's such a lovely question. That could be. I would love to hear what David and Elisa, how you would respond to it too.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I could just briefly say that I love that idea that writing can be part of this act of construction, or a way of constructing. And I think certainly for me, a lot of this research has been a way to find a way to work, and confronting the fact that given everything that we're seeing around us and all of the projections of just vast ecological breakdown, how can an architect work in this time? And so I think for me, writing has been an essential part of trying to find a way to work, because I couldn't imagine simply just saying, okay, I have my architectural degree, now I will go work in office and I will build apartment buildings. There are so many things behind that, the formation even of just that concept that an architecture or that an apartment building has to have that particular configuration that have to be interrogated. And so I think I see writing also as a way to ask those questions, and as the foundation through which a different way of working can be found.
Yeah, I guess I should echo those as well. The text that I published with files was very directly related to the field notes that I was taking, because we weren't able to be there very long. So every night I was kind of just trying to get everything out of my head onto paper, knowing that that the photographs would not tell the story of what was actually happening. And so there was always going to have to be, the two together. There would have to be the text and my own observation, and there would have to be the images, and kind of even just the informal sort of language that I was using, and not being afraid to say I or we. That's very deliberate, and it felt really important to make sure that I was placing myself on the ground and acknowledging the ground, and then allowing the photographs to sometimes zoom way out, or zoom really far in, or look at a single plant, or look at what could be considered as sort of like, the ruins that people hope to see in these kinds of sites, right? And trying to minimize that, scratching that itch, and instead showing the place as it appears, and not looking for those moments of sensation, I guess.
I think that's super nice what you raise. It reminds me of Alexis Borningham has this essay about I was trying to look for it. I can't remember the exact name of the tense. I think it's the passive past tense, and the violence that's held within that, right? Like this was done. This happened to these people, and there's never a figure of characters, right? Who is doing that, and who is doing the witnessing, and so on. And so I think I found that really quite powerful in your piece, is the intimacy of it, and the way that speaks back to that tense that is so associated with those forms of violence.
Yeah, for me, what is really incredible for me, once your three pieces are put together, and also Jack's piece, I'm sorry, that I would encourage everyone actually to read, because it's extremely interesting, because it adds one more layer on how we interpret, in fact, actually traces of civilizations past. But it's actually quite incredible how then reading Elisa's piece, actually her critique really helps me personally actually to put into context many of the incredible actually acts of violence that are described actually in different ways actually in the text actually and photographs actually by David and Thandi. So in a way, there's almost like as David was saying, this movement of zooming in and zooming out, zooming very, very close to our personal experience, and then zooming out and trying to make sense of the bigger picture. And within that, and Thandi, of course, if you need to leave us, I just wanted to thank you so much actually for your contribution to the to the issue, of course, but also to the discussion tonight. It's been really precious, and it taught me really a lot, because I think it's the first time actually that we had a piece that embraced also that type of writing. And I had been looking for something like that for a long time, and it was amazing to be able to do that with you. But maybe before we move on to the last part of the conversation, I have just maybe a quicker question actually to ask from Elisa and David. And I want actually to start that question picking up something that Thandi said earlier about the idea of a particular type of architect or a different type of architect. I think that both your practices as researchers, but also as teachers, are particularly interesting because they show us that we all need to be a particular type of architect somehow, in the sense that actually designing buildings is still very much part of our practice, but it's not the only thing that architects do, and perhaps it's not even the most important thing actually that architects do. And very often I think we give maybe a kind of not really adequate image of what the profession is going to be, even to our students, offering them the idea that actually there's one size fits all, and that 99% of architects are going to come out of school and actually do this. While actually most architects, what they really design is environments or territories. But let's say it's constructs that are actually much broader than just a building. Even when we design a building, we are actually designing an environment anyway. So I was curious to hear actually what you think about this specific predicament of our profession in this specific moment, and whether the reflections actually that you've shown us in your contributions are also reflected somehow in the way you teach, in fact, your students and understand the profession for which you are preparing them, since you're both educators.
David, please.
Okay. We're both like. Yeah, it's a perfect question. Thank you so much, Maria. And it reminds me of conversations that I've had with Platon and Alex, so I can see about the distinction between the discipline and the profession of architecture. And I've always placed myself very squarely in the discipline of architecture and not in the profession. And that's just a decision I made a few decades ago, I think. And I think you're exactly right. The education now has changed so much just in my own career, in which you can have these conversations now in the classroom or in moments like this, in a journal as prestigious as Files. You can expand those notions, and especially into research. And from my own kind of the subjects I've been teaching my career have always been the overlay between visual culture, fine art, and architecture. And that's very much present in my own research. You know, I talk to my students, I just did yesterday, about the kind of the methodology of media, as opposed to using media to be sort of a representative addition to your work, but instead understanding that media can be the focus and the avenue through your work. And it can be the methodology that you work within, which is very much the way that I've always kind of imagined my own work. So yeah, I mean, you know, hearing the three of us together also is such a nice group, because we have such different topics that we're discussing, but there's a connection between them, and the kind of way, what they used to say, kind of an expanded understanding of architecture, which I think is even already a bit out of date to say that.
Yeah, and I mean, just to continue on that last point, I think what I loved about being in dialogue in this issue, especially with the two of you, is, you know, for me, like, it's impossible to do any of these things alone, right? And the way in which both the discipline and the practice really affect anything is through these very vast kinds of collaborations. And I think we have to think through all of this together. And for me, the project of Carbon Form was something that from the beginning I knew I couldn't do alone, right? And I was very lucky to be able to initiate the project through a guest edited issue of Log. But it was instrumental for me to be able to be in dialogue with all those other authors, because I felt that it's such a big problem that there were only so many things that I could think about. And I needed to work with others. It was just impossible to do it in any other way. And so I've been very grateful to constantly be able to be in dialogue throughout this whole project, starting with the log issue, but then with my students as well. And I feel very fortunate to have been able to have the conversations that I've had about these ideas with my students. And for me, in terms of teaching, I sort of frame it in that way to them and saying, I don't know the answers. This is a problem that I'm thinking through, and I would like your help. And that has, I think, been very, very fruitful. But I think I also want to say a point about the discipline and the practice. Because I've also been someone who has tried to place myself on the disciplinary side much more than the practice side, although I do have a small practice. But I spend a lot of time on my teaching and on my writing. And in many ways, one of my goals in this project has been to argue that the problem of climate change is a disciplinary problem, which for too long it was placed more as an issue of practice, specifically one of building systems. And so a big part of my effort has been to say, no, this is something that we can talk about within the discipline on architectural terms, of course, requiring interdisciplinary thinking, but there's something about the discipline of architecture that is useful here. There is something about the spatial building blocks of this whole thing that we can intervene upon. And so I think in terms of the role of the architect, we shouldn't just be thinking about ourselves as sort of practicing designers, where we're sort of given a program and we kind of give it a general shape, or, worst case scenario, the description, the most cynical and pessimistic description is that we just decorate whatever capitalism needs, right? But I mean, I think what we can do at this time is that as architects, we can fundamentally question what is being built and why, and make suggestions for something different that should be built. And that fundamentally is a question of architectural thought, is something that an architect can absolutely participate in. And in that case, the disciplinary aspect of architecture becomes all the more important, so that we are not constantly constrained by the limits of practice, which are so defined by the structure of the profession, which is so defined simply by the logic of capitalism. So we cannot think of practice as the only way in which we have agency in the world, even if the people who are practicing are the people that are out there building things. But it has to be the reciprocity, because there's a kind of enclosure around the profession as well, so to speak, and a limit to how much the profession can do on the terms that it's been sort of defined. And so I think the other thing that's unique about architecture, though, is that in the context of school, we have that dialogue between the discipline and the practice. And so, there are other disciplines in the humanities, let's say, that don't have you don't have sort of like practicing sociologists as opposed to people who only write, people who have firms and people who theorize. You don't have that same divide in other areas. And in that case, architecture, I think, is also very special, because we speak to each other, right? People who end up being just practitioners still go through school, and we read theory, we read history as part of our training and our formation. So I don't know, I think all of that is just to say that architecture, I think, is a unique discipline. And I think as much as it's easy to think that there's a lack of agency in this moment, I think there are all of these ways in which we can see that there's something just because of the way that architecture works and the way that architecture has to deal with the built world, that means that there's an entry point for us to really affect all of these issues.
Thank you so much. And actually, that gives me a perfect way to introduce the last contribution. And I'm sorry, Christina, that we arrived so late to you, and you've been a real hero, being here ill and so on and so forth. So I mean, I cannot thank you enough. But I think that really Christina's contribution for me actually continues exactly this discussion on agency that Elisa was mentioning. And I strongly believe in the same things that actually Elisa just explained. So the fact that in fact there is a disciplinary power to what we do, even even vis-a-vis, in fact, actually issues that very often seem outside of the control of architects. So with that being said, I just want to introduce Christina Varvia, who is actually an AA alumna of 2014 and a former diploma unit master until last year. Actually, she was leading a diploma unit together with Merve Anil. And actually, she is currently, in fact, a PhD candidate at Aarhus University. She is a founding member of Forensis and formerly the deputy director of forensic architecture, of which she is now currently a research fellow. So I would leave her the floor. And I think actually with her contribution, maybe we can wrap the discussion of today, because her contribution is really about the body. And I think it's a very, very radical piece that I think encourages us, again, a bit as Elisa said, to use the tools of architecture to fundamentally question, in fact, actually issues that very often are portrayed as outside of the agency, in fact, actually of architecture itself. Thanks, Christina.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I will try to be quite brief, mainly because I think everyone wants to get on with their weekend. And also, this is not what you need to see, this is. And also because my energy levels might be a little bit low, but it's a real pleasure to be here. And again, I would like to extend, as everyone else, my very warm thanks to Maria and Christina for inviting me to do this piece, and also to be in very good company today and to learn. I've already learned so much from all of the other kind of writers and panelists. So this piece really was a bit of it was really helpful for me because it was a transition. It started kind of as a springboard. I started from this the brief that I had written actually with Merve Anil for the unit I was running at the AA, and it was also kind of a transition between that work and my PhD. It was one of the first things that I wrote for my PhD, and so it was a really useful kind of way to have the space to think through that. And I'll try to be quite brief, but I'm starting with this image, although these two images don't really exist in part in the essay, but they're obviously the elephant in the room, very classical images that any architect would have seen, this idea of the modular and the Vitruvian man, and really kind of starting from this obvious kind of feminist and post-humanist critique that questions who are we designing for? And so what I wanted to do with this piece was a little bit beyond kind of querying the different binaries that we're designing from beyond kind of gender, ability, age, ethnicity, et cetera, and to really consider what kind of material understandings we have of the body and how we could possibly render the human body as a field rather than a distinct object. So I really kind of started the other image that I started with, and that is included in the essay, is this, which was kind of something I found through a blog post, an internet blog post, which was the title was "The Human Cube: The Volume of Humanity" by Phil Plait. And it was a very kind of funny little experiment, which almost kind of a back of the envelope calculation that estimated how much space would it take if we pack every person currently alive, population of approximately 7.6 billion people, an average of 62 kilos per body, let's say, if we pack them closely next to one another. And essentially the kind of calculation gives us this number, a cube with a volume of 0.45 kilometers cube. So that is an equivalent essentially of this cube that you see rendered next to the San Francisco bridge, which I forgot the name of, but I blame my illness, if anything.
Golden Gate.
Thank you, Golden Gate. And then essentially it's this cube that measures 770 meters on each side. So this kind of caught my imagination because it was treating human bodies not as kind of this precious thing, but rather as this material kind of object, so to speak, so, things that have material properties. And also it caught my imagination because it is essentially something, it is a cube of the scale of an architectural mega project. So it's, as a comparison, it is 36 times bigger than the largest building currently in existence, which is the Boeing Everett factory in the US. And so I started thinking, obviously, we don't like to live very closely packed next to one another, and we've taken up every corner of the planet. But I started to think, what would it be like if we were to think of the body really materially? And so the essay is a little bit of a kind of thought provocation. It's a kind of thinking experiment, so to speak, which is to say, what if we refuse the skin as an absolute limit to the human body, and where could we redraw its boundaries? I started by imagining this version of the body, which includes the memory of all material bits that ever came to be it. So every bite of food it ever consumed, every drop of water that has ever quenched our thirst, every molecule of oxygen that we ever breathed, and all the excrement we ever produced. And I was attempting here to kind of render that and to think about it quantifiably. And kind of this footage that you see is from kind of a little video that I'm working on. But essentially the proposition is to take almost a long exposure photograph of a body throughout its lifetime, and to think about what this would include. So in this sort of long array, we should also include the 35 tons of foods that a person consumes in its lifetime. This is on average. 62,400 liters of water, 242.2 liters of air, 12.1 million of which is oxygen that is turned into energy. And it also means that this body would have to include the 3.4 tons of excrement that it will produce in its lifetime, 37.3 thousand liters of urine, and 590 miles of hair. It will also be particulate matter, pulverized concrete and forest, airborne lead, soot, and it will have breathed in sulfuric acid, ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, sodium chloride, metals and dust, pollen and mold. And so I'm kind of trying to visualize all of those things as they come to pass through the body, and I've chosen kind of a microscopic lens in order to render matter in a similar scale, but one that moves across from kind of human texture to foods, etc., etc. And again, I wanted to make, I'm just kind of leave it here, the images I will leave here for a second, but a little note on methodology is that I'm drawing numbers from statistics, calculations, and conversions that are kind of overly simplifying individual patterns, which is obviously the opposite of what I want to do. I don't want to kind of equalize human bodies. Obviously, there are multiple differences between various groups, and these numbers radically average out the way that a human body can be captured. But I wanted to essentially arrive at a number that captures our imagination as a body as space, right? But I'm referring in the essay as the expanded body. And so the attempt here is to kind of draw this image of vastness of matter that flows through our bodies, that is connected to us quite intimately, and that it comes to be us and affects us. And various different thinkers would say are actants within us. And I'm also here trying to kind of subvert or twist a little bit this notion of anthropometry that uses quantification in order to stratify the human species in various subcategories. That is kind of a violent, let's say, a practice that has had quite violent histories. But what I'm trying to do is kind of subvert that in order to try to say that actually there's a way that we are connected with our environments that are quite fundamental. And so there is this notion of kind of proximity that I'm trying to bring forward. And I'm doing this in order to really ask kind of a critical question of how could we really advocate for an individualistic world when, in fact, materially speaking, we are also very much connected. So what this notion of the expanded body, I hope, does is collapses the space between body and environment, and collapses things like human rights and environmental rights. There is no distinction between the two when you think about those material flows. And that is also to say very much in line with indigenous thinking, which is something that I didn't have space to explore so much in this essay, but it also to recognize that it is very much kind of in continuity with the way that different indigenous communities don't even have a word for nature, because we are nature, right? So it's not about nature defending. We are defending nature, as kind of Isabel Stengers was quoting from an activist. It's not that we don't defend nature; we're nature defending itself, right? And so. Kind of there's different stages in the essay where I'm kind of moving outwards, but the last part, and just to say to maybe to close on that, is kind of expanding further and further away, and just to say that one of the points of departure was thinking about the way that COVID, this my current molecular companion, let's say, has offered different kind of ways of thinking about things. So, for example, contact tracing is something that I was thinking about and taking a bit, not as contact tracing as the kind of current practice of the UK government or others that can be criticized, etc., but more to think about contact tracing conceptually and as an investigative methodology, to think about it as a material network exercise where essentially we're able to trace the ways that we interact with particular material substances, and the ways that, for example, through the haptic sense or through the touch, we are connected with materials worldwide. And so to take that, really seriously is also to think about our own accountability and our own position within a space where politics is really kind of distributed within field causalities, but rather to say that there is a critical stance, and that critical stance is our own body and the way that it connects very specifically through the material world. I think I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Christina. This was really wonderful, and I think a fantastic ending. I mean, at least for me, of this experience that we had together, actually creating this issue of files, and this notion of the expanded body. I think it's so thought-provoking. And I think the reason why it's particularly thought-provoking to me is that you bring it back again to architecture. So to the fact that actually the expanded body is not somebody else's business, it's also our business as architects and designers, and we can still have something to say about that, and we can still find agency in fact in that notion, exactly as Elisa was suggesting earlier. I would have a million questions for you, but I know that you already made an incredible effort actually, and I think also your explanation was so rich that I'm almost like afraid of ruining it now by adding something, but in the few minutes that we have left, I would rather leave maybe the floor open to everyone, both the audience and our authors, if they have the final remarks or some questions in general. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but if there is something that actually either from the audience or the authors you want to say or you want to ask, I think this is that moment. I see here some of our other authors, and I want to thank all of them actually for their really incredible contributions. I'm sorry that we had to make a small selection for tonight. The criteria was very simple. We went by themes and then by people that we knew were able actually to join us because of time zones and so on and so forth. But I think that all the other contributions are equally interesting, and I think what was great for me of the conversation tonight is that many authors actually underlined how we don't exist in a vacuum. None of us is alone. We all work up to a certain degree, actually, collectively, and things like a journal are always more than the sum of the parts. I mean, in a way, I think each of these essays actually is interesting in its own right, and I hope that it will go on to have a life, of course, beyond the issue of the journal. It will go, of course, on JSTOR and so on and so forth. It might appear in books then eventually, but I think that then if you see the issues as a kind of collective work of all of these people that you met tonight and the other people who contributed, and also YEA staff that I mentioned earlier, so Christina, Sasha, Oli, Ryan, Anna, and everyone else, and I hope that I'm not forgetting anyone. I think it really to me really goes to show that this is really a collective endeavor. If anyone actually wants to add something from the audience or from the authors.
I just wanted to say, thank you so much. I just wanted to say that I think this, I completely feel like there's so many overlapping themes, and that it's really nice to kind of see there are these kind of overlaps in interests with quite a wide range of researchers, writers, and people who are part of the profession and the practice of architecture. So it's just very encouraging, and I think it is really a brilliant job in kind of curating that as the editor, you and Christina and the others, and Sasha, Ollie. So thank you so much for doing that. Yeah. It's really nice. For example, I felt like from the home file, my article with flashes, like I just think it's really brilliant pairing. So I think it really works.
Thanks, Bushra. I mean, Flash did a fantastic job. So I hope that, I mean, it's not, I mean, I could say that of all of the essays, but I mean, in particular, I think actually the pairing of the two of you, all of these pairings are up to a certain degree serendipitous, because of course we have, essays coming in, and then we think which ones actually are somehow talking to each other. And I mean, I have to say it's also a lot of fun, to be honest, actually, to see how they develop through time. Sometimes actually your essays shift through files, because they start in a specific file and then they shift towards something else also while you develop them, of course. So they change actually through the months actually that you spend writing them, obviously.
Yeah, it's a brilliant process. Can't wait for the next one. And to still read all the essays in this one, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
And I wanted actually to leave Christina last, really, because I thought actually your essay for me was really, it's a statement. It's somehow the statement of that, gathers many of the things that I personally believe in, not only actually as editor, but especially as a teacher. And I think it was really nice also to see how many people involved in education and how many actually former students were part actually of this issue. I think it's part of, I think, a healthy culture of the school to be, producing and consuming culture at the same time, and doing that in this kind of relationship between tutors and students who then become tutors from other schools as well. So that's also one of the reasons why I wanted specifically some of you to be here tonight. So people who run a unit right now, like Bushra and Manijeh, and people who ran a unit in the past, like Christina. But I would be repeating myself, but I mean, I just want to thank everyone. And I think because it's Friday night, actually, to wish you a great Friday night and a great weekend, and to wish a swift recovery specifically to Christina, because I'm in awe of how amazingly generous you were with us, actually, to even to wait, because I really wanted you as the final statement somehow of the issue. But again, huge thanks to everyone, and we will see each other hopefully actually at the end of the year, when we will be launching actually issue 79 that is actually being crafted right now. See you soon in school, hopefully.
Thank you, Maria.
Bye, see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.